Henry Mayer, who later became known professionally as High Mayer, was born in the German town of Worms in 1868. It seems fairly certain that he had no formal art education because he'd already been working professionally as an illustrator for various magazines in Germany before emigrating to America at the age of only 18 in 1886. What he did on arrival and where he settled are unrecorded, but the earliest examples of his work I could find come from the humour magazine Truth in 1890. He moved to New York in 1893 and carried on contributing to Truth, and in 1896 he also designed this poster for Scribner's magazine. In the following year he started to create book illustrations, beginning with a series of expressive gestural monochromes for the children's story The Autobiography of a Monkey, written by Albert Bigelow Paine. And all Mayer's images clearly demonstrated his facility for humorous narrative work and his light touch with pen and ink. He carried on producing illustrations for magazines, adding the prestigious Judge to his list of clients, and there was also evidence of some sequential strip work for the New York World Sunday supplement. He even made an isolated appearance on the cover of the French humour magazine Le Rire in 1898. In 1900, Mayer illustrated his own children's book A Trip to Toyland, a whimsical tale which was printed in full colour from his series of charming and slightly surreal line and colour wash originals. And in the following year, another of his own books, Adventures of a Japanese Doll, was published, featuring similarly graceful images, which this time were well suited to the Oriental theme of the story. And its popular success in book form led to a syndicated strip serialisation later the same year. He followed this in 1901 with another colour collection for Little People, an alphabet book in verse by T.W.H. Crossland, featuring freestanding images of children in costumes representing various countries around the world. In the early years of the century he continued to create occasional cartoons and illustrations for humour magazines and newspapers, but in 1908 he returned to children's books with his illustrated edition of Mark E. Swan's Top of the World, featuring a collection of particularly absorbing and imaginative lightly comic pen and wash fantasy images printed in full colour. But following this he appears to have abandoned children's illustration, and in addition to creating publicity material for the Ziegfeld Follies reviews, he returned in earnest to Puck. In 1914 he was actually appointed their chief staff cartoonist, and for several years to come he produced a large volume of exceptionally engrossing and visually articulate composite double-image page colour illustrations, which satirised aspects of life and current affairs in the USA at the time. Each of them could be studied for some time, with smaller vignetted humour which orbited a central image which defined the subject being satirised with great comedic eloquence. Most of the images were quite frivolous, but on occasion he created more hard-hitting, highly memorable images too, and particularly in response to the First World War and the USA's ultimate involvement in 1917. At this time he also became involved with animation, and worked on several series of shorts between 1914 and 1926. Some of these combined drawn animation with live-action footage, and despite their rather unimpressive quality and absence of his usual visual sophistication, they were fairly successful with the public. He also worked as an actor and director of live-action shorts up to 1936, but what he did in later years is unknown, and all I can add is that High Mayer died in 1954 at the age of 86. Adolph Treidler was born in Westcliff, Colorado in 1886 to immigrant German parents, but he left home at the age of only 16, and from 1902 to 1904 he attended the California School of Design. In 1906 he left for Chicago, where he worked as a staff artist for the Tribune newspaper, and only 18 months later he moved again to New York and undertook yet more study at the Robert Henry School of Art. One of the paintings he created there included an image of a Pierce Arrow car, which was spotted by an art director from the ad agency who handled the car maker's account. He was subsequently offered commissions to create advertising work for them, and Treidler's career took a marked upward trajectory, with other work coming in from Collier's magazine and others. This rise in his popularity coincided with the USA's involvement in World War I, and he designed a large volume of domestic propaganda posters to aid the war effort, all of which harnessed the potent graphic impact of flat posterized colour to great effect. Once the war had ended, he turned his talent for eye-catching posters back to commercial work, although only briefly, and he set about creating more press advertising for Pierce Arrow. And at this point he was becoming increasingly popular for the production of similarly styled images to adorn the covers of any number of American magazines. And during the 1920s, while poster work was apparently absent from his output, he created any number of images for a range of mainstream magazines, including a return to Collier's towards the end of the decade. But in the wake of the 1930 Wall Street crash, Pierce Arrow went out of business. Magazines tightened their belts, and for the next few years things got considerably quieter for Treidler. But within a couple of years his career picked up momentum again when he started to create a large volume of advertising work for the Bermuda Board of Trade, with press ads evoking the many charms of the island for those who could afford it. And at the same time he also began creating paintings of the island's scenery, which were sold as lithographic prints. But only a few years later grim reality made another unwelcome appearance in the form of the Second World War, and Treidler stepped up as he had in the first conflict with a series of particularly compelling and emotionally charged propaganda posters, all of which were aimed at American civilians and designed to stir patriotic emotions and support the fighting forces and their sacrifice for the country. When the war ended in 1945, he was one of several illustrators who featured in the children's book On Longer Trails, but the images he produced were some distance from his best work. Then in the later 1940s he returned to form with another series of striking posters, this time produced on behalf of the Bermuda Tourist Board. The posters again extol the charms of this idyllic location, using his long-established posterized colour technique with hints of romance and beautiful scenery to attract American tourists. The campaign not only boosted the number of travellers to Bermuda, but its success led to other travel-themed work for Treidler from any number of other clients, including Aer Lingus and the Furness Cruise Line. But not much later it seems he stopped working commercially, although he continued to paint landscapes in oils and watercolours for quite a few years to come. And Adolph Treidler died in 1981 at the age of 95 in New Jersey. Eduardo Garcia Benito was born in Valladolid in Spain in 1891, and after completing his studies at the School of Fine Art in Madrid, he left for Paris in 1910. There he studied with the painter Lucien Mignon until 1912, when he was awarded a scholarship to study for a year at the École des Beaux-Arts. Following his studies he started work at a Parisian printing house, and when the Great War began in 1914 he created a series of patriotic images produced as a combination of wood engraving and pochoir printed colour. Some were created as limited editions, but there were others produced for wider audiences, reproduced in books and magazines during the years of the war. All of them exhibited a distinctive expressionistic style, and when the war ended, he continued to use this approach for the 1918 publication of a book about the city of Reims. But over the next couple of years he abandoned this approach in favour of something altogether more modernist and predictive of the stylistic conceits of what would in a few years' time be called Art Deco. And as much of the work he was now producing was for the Parisian fashion magazines of the period, such as La Gazette du Bon Temps, his redefined style proved a perfect fit for the ethos of the time. Within a couple of years the images he'd been creating drew the attention of both Vanity Fair and Vogue, and in addition to monochrome page illustrations he produced a collection of sophisticated, geometrically informed, flat colour covers. These illustrations had a stylistic similarity to the work of the artists Constantin Brancusi and the paintings of Amedeo Modigliani, but they were certainly no mere copies. But although the images he created for the magazine shared a fascination for elongated geometrical figurework and an abiding influence from African decorative art, Benito varied his graphic approach from cover to cover with great success. At this time, everybody wanted to be associated with the glamour and modernity of Art Deco, and Benito was rightly seen as one of its greatest and most sophisticated exponents. He also created this immensely compelling and attractive poster for women's shoes, but other than this isolated example, it continued to be magazine illustration which dominated his output. And this continued to be the case into the 1930s, at which point it seems he lost interest in the more rigid formality of Art Deco, and the covers he was creating by the early years of the decade took on a far more loosely rendered impressionistic look. Of course, the Second World War was no time for such frivolity, and for the duration there appears to be a total lack of evidence of his work. He did create this poster in 1946, the year after the war ended, but otherwise Benito abandoned illustration altogether, and he returned to Spain, where he saw out his days as a painter, up to his eventual death in 1981 at 90 years old. Saul Tepper was born in New York in 1899, and in his teens he studied at the Grand Central School of Art in the city. After graduating, he worked initially as a hand-lettering artist in a commercial art studio run by the immensely successful Albert Dawn, and in 1920 he married Beatrice Lindenberg, and the couple later had 2 children. Having effectively served an apprenticeship at Dawn's studio, in 1925 he set up his own, and had considerable immediate success with magazine work, initially for Liberty, followed quickly by Collier's. And the images he produced for them led to a large volume of other illustration commissions for the many magazines published by the Curtis Publishing Group. Among them were immensely popular titles such as Ladies' Home Journal, The Saturday Evening Post and Country Gentleman. Although all Tepper's work was staunchly representational, it was painted with an energetic and expressive application of oils, and whatever the subject or narrative he was commissioned to illustrate, he unfailingly supplied credible images which successfully captured the perfect dramatic moment with great credibility and visual skill. Some were monochrome only, but many more were produced in full colour, and there are also examples using limited palettes to great effect. And like many of his contemporaries, a significant number of his images were created as oddly shaped vignettes, which made perfect graphic sense when arranged with the text on the double-page spread. By the later 1920s, he had unsurprisingly become one of the most in-demand magazine illustrators in the country, and there were very few being published in the USA at the time that he didn't make an appearance in. Naturally enough, the high profile and widespread popularity he had achieved through his magazine illustrations led to offers of advertising work in the later 1920s into the 30s, including this compelling billboard poster for Piedmont cigarettes and a long-running press ad campaign for Electrolux fridges. But it was his emotionally charged magazine illustration, much of which continued to dramatically exploit the potential of two-colour printing, which continued to occupy most of his time throughout the decade. I was fortunate enough to find some evidence of his working practices, which clearly show that he created rough but informative sketches of the proposed illustration. And then there were quick colour studies to give a good indication of the final outcome. And in this photograph, Tepper himself is seen posing with a young señorita, which was the basis of the actual illustration, leaving little, if anything, to chance. And he used all these methods and techniques to maintain his position as one of the most successful figurative illustrators of the early 20th century in the USA. And in addition to the incredible volume of illustration he produced to keep his clients happy, he also found time to work successfully as a writer of music for various popular performers of the period. During the Second World War, he created stirring patriotic posters and a series of press ads for Coca-Cola, which traded shamelessly on the international nature of the Allies, spuriously suggesting that the product formed a bond between the various nations. Immediately after the war, he returned to his expected magazine commissions, although with somewhat less productivity than his pre-war output. But in 1950 he returned to advertising with a batch of stirring historical portraits, which were used as press ads for Alcoa Travel. Well, following this commission, Tepper took a job working on TV commercials for the agency J. Walter Thompson, whilst also teaching at both the Pratt Institute and the Cooper Union, and he died at the age of 79 in 1987. See you next time around, and thanks for watching.